Welcome to another edition of the PlanWell podcast, hosted by owner and attorney of Cary Estate Planning, Paul Yokobitis.
Hey everybody, welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of the PlanWell podcast. I'm Paul Yokobitis, and today I wanted to talk about some recent news. USA Today broke this at the end of last week. It's pertaining to another celebrity estate, somebody who passed away without a will. And so it came out last week that Chadwick Boseman had passed away. Obviously, that's not news to anybody. He passed away back in August, but that he had his surviving wife. Her name is Simone Ledward, had submitted probate filings to the Los Angeles County Probate Court last Thursday, and that the estate was opened intestate, meaning that Chadwick did not have a will. And so what Simone is petitioning to become is the administrator, which is the role that a personal representative for an estate would receive if there is no will appointing an executor. And so the issue that this sort of creates is somewhat, several. First is that it should come as no surprise that celebrities pass away without wills, especially when they're young. If you think of like Heath Ledger, people who passed away unexpectedly at a young age, it should come as no surprise that some celebrities don't do advanced planning or any sort of proactive estate planning, even though they are generally more wealthy than the average American, and that they are involved in more formal financial and legal proceedings than the average American. The circumstances surrounding the lives of young adults are all pretty similar in that they don't think that they're going to die anytime soon. So while Chadwick Boseman was 43 when he passed away, which is definitely still young, it's certainly younger than the average age of people who are usually contemplating estate planning, especially if you don't have kids. Which is the case for Chadwick. He was married but did not have any kids. He had siblings and parents that survived him in South Carolina. But everything was basically, Chadwick Boseman and his wife, Simone Ledward. And so it's not super uncommon for a married couple that doesn't have any kids to not do estate planning. But Chadwick Boseman knew that he was sick, right? He had been battling cancer for 4 years prior to his death in August. And so usually when you get a bad diagnosis, it sort of overrides your preconceptions of immortality as a young adult. And so one would assume that somebody who has a stage 3 colon cancer diagnosis that has been battling, for up to 4 years at that point, would do some proactive estate planning, at least for the purposes of creating things like powers of attorney to allow Simone to coordinate his financial affairs, make his medical decisions, and then set out end of life wishes. But it would also, we would assume then also that there would be some sort of legacy planning. Like a will, like a trust. A lot of people in Chadwick Boseman's position would do trust-based planning in conjunction with, jointly owned property with rights of survivorship, beneficiary designated financial accounts, and those things. So the fact that he did pass away after such a long cancer battle, to not have estate planning in place is pretty surprising. But then you kind of look over recent history of other celebrities, and certainly African-American celebrities that have passed away without planning as well. You think about Aretha Franklin, Prince, neither of them, they were much older than Chadwick Boseman. Neither of them had a will. Their estates are still open because of the ramifications of a lack of planning. And when you look at statistics surrounding the rates of African-American individuals creating wills, they're significantly lower than the average American. So I believe over 3/4 of African Americans in our country do not have estate planning in place, which is about 10 to 15% higher than the national average. So the question becomes why, right? Is it an access to justice question? Is it a cultural or norm-based question? If the people around you are not planning, are you then less likely to plan yourself? Is it somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy or a cycle that sort of perpetuates itself? Certainly, that's not to say that there haven't been non-African American celebrities who have passed away without wills. There's plenty of them, right? But when you compare that to the national average of just the general average person, there is such a disparity between people of color getting advanced estate planning and not. And so it sort of, again, begs the question of why. I think that there are a lot of barriers to planning that people either believe are there that maybe aren't, or that really are there. And some of that is cost, some of that is access, some of that is confusion, intimidation. There's a lot of reasons why people don't plan, but there needs to be some sort of answer to it. And maybe that's, something that will improve over time through, access to justice initiatives, something like that. But when it comes to somebody like Chadwick Boseman, those sorts of, issues or hurdles, you would think don't really apply as much because he is so wealthy, because he is so well known, surrounds himself with people who probably have done estate planning. And then to compound it, that he knew that he was sick, that he knew that he was fighting a battle that he was losing. Even up until the days before he passed, that's usually a time, when last minute planning can be orchestrated. But another thing to remember is that these sorts of filings are pretty limited as to what they show with the total picture. And what I mean by that is for instance, the pleadings that Simone Ledward filed to open probate in Los Angeles County were just showing what the estate's value was. And so it was just less than $1 million. So a lot of, assumptions were made based on that he was not as well off as people thought, or that he had squandered his money or any other sort of, misconceptions based on that number. That number is just probate assets. It's the assets that he owned that needed to go through the estate in order to be transitioned in ownership. And so that could be just because they're bank accounts that didn't get designated. It could be stock holdings that weren't designated. There could be, several millions of dollars worth of assets that did not pass through the estate just because of the way people usually set up accounts. That could be rights of survivorship, beneficiary designations. He could have owned marital property with Simone that transferred to her automatically. He could have TOD or POD designated bank accounts to Simone or to his parents. There's a lot of assumptions that can be drawn, or a lot of conclusions that can be drawn from these sorts of filings, but people who don't really know what probate means and what it entails. But given the fact that Chadwick was involved in many significantly popular and successful movies like 42, like obviously the Black Panther franchise, or everything that came off of the Black Panther movie, Get On Up, Marshall, Defy Bloods, which is Spike Lee's movie that came out earlier this year. I don't think anybody can, in good faith, just assume that the $900,000 that was filed in the probate filings was all that he owned. Now, California law probably treats things a little bit differently than North Carolina, but I would make assumptions that there's a lot of similarities in that his intestate heirs are probably going to be the same people who they would be in North Carolina. Since he had no kids, he was married. Simone, his wife, is probably going to get the lion's share of the estate value. But you can see from the pleadings that Chadwick's parents were listed as potential beneficiaries. And that's because that's the way it works in a lot of states when it comes to intestacy. If you're not survived by kids, if you are married, if you do not have a will, sometimes your parents will be unintentionally included in your estate. And that's sort of one of the significant values of proactive planning, is that you choose your heirs. And a lot of people when they're married, would prefer everything to go to their spouse rather than to their parents. There's also some mention in the USA Today and the Black Enterprise articles about the estate that Chadwick's siblings were not named, even though he had 2 siblings, that they were not listed. Just Leroy and Carolyn Boseman, which are his parents, were listed. And that's not surprising either. It doesn't mean that, his siblings were cut out of the estate, by any malicious means. It's that they're just not his intestate heirs, and it's because his parents are still living. That's generally how it would work in North Carolina and I think a lot of states. So the big thing is, don't draw too many conclusions based on what, the public record says about, probate filings. Certainly if you haven't planned, you need to. I think everybody in this state, everybody in this country needs a will and powers of attorney at the very least, and to audit their financial accounts to make sure that beneficiary designations are up to date and naming the people who you intend to receive those assets, just to avoid, this sort of circumstance. The reality is that I think most people wouldn't want their business, in the public eye. The average American doesn't have to worry about that, but it doesn't mean that they're not subject to public disclosure. The probate process is public record. So, creating, an estate plan that avoids probate filings as much as possible can limit or eliminate that reality for most people. But if you have significant wealth, you need to plan. I mean, there's no excuse not to, whether you're young or not. And there are plenty of young entrepreneurs and young professionals who have significant wealth that have not planned yet. You don't have to have kids to plan. There are plenty of married couples or single individuals who have no kids but have wishes worth enforcing. And so if that's the case, then you need to create a legal plan that's going to enforce those wishes. That's just the way it needs to happen. So it's incredibly unfortunate, and my condolences to Chadwick's family. This absolutely could have been avoided. Trust planning, beneficiary designations would have been very appropriate for Chadwick, given what I assume would be his overall net worth. The other reality of this too is obviously he passed away from an illness. People pass away from accidents and overdoses and stuff like that all the time. And that's usually the sort of celebrity death that we see is usually not from sickness. It's from, something that happened abruptly, like Kobe Bryant, like Heath Ledger, like any number of different celebrities who passed away untimely. It's not something that you're sort of aiming at a date and planning ahead for it. So planning ahead is always a good idea. Whenever you are, finding yourself in a situation where you have wishes that you want to be enforced, that you have assets that you want to leave behind in a meaningful way. Unfortunately, this won't be the last time that we hear about celebrity deaths with a lack of planning. They happen seemingly every year. And you would think things like this in the public eye would enforce upon or impress upon people the need and the value of planning. But here we are.
That's it for this week's episode. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share. We'll see you all next time.